Okay, so now let's talk about the part 2 of the first experiment, which is intensity. So we're going to be working with the idea of intensity, which logic would say that it would mean brightness, right? How bright is the light? And I've demonstrated earlier how to adjust on these lamps, how to adjust the intensity of the light. Basically, how bright is it or how not bright is it? We like to set these at 50% to start off as a default and then go from there. If we need more intensity, we can crank it up brighter. If we need less, of course, crank it down. And that's, of course, that has something to do with intensity. However, that's not necessarily what we're talking about when we are dealing with intensity, although it is a portion of it. What we're really talking about, what we're really talking about is the relationship of more than one light source. If we have two light sources in a lighting setup, what's the relationship of those two light sources in terms of intensity? Now, the main light source, or in other words, the brightest light source, is called the key light source, the key. And we'll call that guy over there the key light source. It's set at 50%. And it is lighting this scenario as I have it set up just like this. Okay? Now, one of the advantages to having multiple lights is we can create a dynamic that we couldn't otherwise. There are other tips and tricks that we can use to modify with only one light source, but in this case we're going to be using a second light source, and that second light source is called the fill light. So you have your key light, and then you have a fill light. A fill light is a secondary light source, and it is always lower in intensity than the key. Otherwise, you would have a one-to-one situation, meaning the key and the fill would be the same brightness, and you would in effect be interfering with the quality of light called direction, which is what we worked on in part 1. So when we introduce another light source, what we want to do is figure out just what is the relationship going to be. So for instance, if the second light that we bring in is half as bright as the first one, then we can consider that to be a 1 to 2. In other words, it's for every one key light, it would take 2 fill in order to equal or match the brightness. So here we have a lamp source. It's a secondary light source. It's identical in terms of the model as the first one. And so what we're going to do is we're going to aim this guy right in there to fill in some of the shadows of the scene. And here's what we have to kind of consider. If we're using this light source as a key, and we mean for it to be half as bright as the fill, we have two ways in which we can do that. Because these lamps have a dimmer set on them, you could simply set the dimmer at half the brightness of the key. So if that one's at 50, this one now is 25. This only really works, however, if the light is the same distance from the source. Because if I have this light setting right up against one of these bottles here, it's going to be very close, right? And so therefore, even though this is a 25% brightness, it has a lot less distance for it to go, and in fact could render brighter than what the key is giving us. And so we want these to be relatively the same distance from the objects here in order to have this one be reading as half as bright. So that is one way to do it. A second way to do it would be to simply take advantage of, again, fall off. So if I move this light source twice the distance of the other one, so if I were to measure this first light source and figure, let's say that's about 18 inches, and then I were to take this fill to the center of the table and figure, oh, now that's 36 inches, suddenly these two can be the same brightness, so both of them at 50%, and yet this one serves as a fill because it's twice the distance, and therefore by the time it reaches our set, it is half as bright. The benefit of this is effectively to fill in the shadows and to modify the overall brightness of the set. So in our experiment, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working on a variety of compositions. We may move the camera around, unlike in the first one. So we could, aim the light source here, we could be moving it over there. Wherever we happen to be, we can be moving the bottles around and so on. And we're going to experiment with a variety of different lighting ratios or setups where we have a key light and then we have a fill light. So one other important thing to identify and remember about the relationships of these two light sources is that they are not in the same location. They're not necessarily coming from the same direction. If this key light happened to be all the way around over here, let's just say, for instance, I have the main light source here. This would be the key light source. And then I were to position this second light source right here. They're very close to one another. So effectively what's happening is these two light sources now are aiming in the same direction, and therefore the effect is that they're both contributing as key lights. The light is combining themselves basically, and so we don't have two distinctly different light sources when we do something like that. This is actually one way we can pump up the intensity of our key light, is to add a second light source from the exact same direction, and suddenly what we have here is the ability of taking whatever the brightness is of these and doubling it in intensity. That's not what we're doing for this experiment. What we want to do is have these to be at least, let's just say, at least two positions away from each other. So in this case, this one is set at lighting compass position 2, and this one is set at lighting position number 4. And that is the minimum distance that you would want them to be in order for one to behave as a key light and the other as a fill light. If this one was too close, once again, they would be blending in such a way that they effectively would become one key light. You could, of course, have this farther away. It doesn't have to just be the two. It could be all the way around over here. So I would say just the minimum is going to be two direction points away from each other.